Good evening, fellow adventurers. How are you today? I hope you're doing well and ready to journey through time together with Nightly Historian.
The desert is silent now. A wind drifts across the pale New Mexico sand, carrying with it nothing but heat and dust. Yet beneath this stillness lies the memory of the loudest sound the world has ever known. They built a city here once, a city that officially did not exist. No streets on any map, no mail, no name, just a collection of minds and machines buried behind barbed wire and silence. To the people who lived inside, it was simply the hill. To the rest of the world, it was invisible. And to history, it would become the place where humanity learned how to unmake itself. In the summer heat of 1945, the sky above New Mexico lit up twice, once by the sun and once by something man-made, something brighter, purer, and infinitely more dangerous. Every generation inherits a secret. Ours began here, in this desert, when science crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Before the first atomic flash, before Hiroshima, before the Cold War's shadow, there was only this quiet place filled with dust, hope, and equations. The men and women who came here were not soldiers. They were dreamers, mathematicians, poets of matter and energy. They believed they were ending a war. Instead, they began a new one that still hums quietly beneath every city on Earth. It began in 1943. America was fighting across two oceans, and victory seemed far away. In Washington, behind closed doors, a handful of generals and scientists were shown the impossible, theoretical proof that splitting a single atom could release the power of the sun. That knowledge could win the war or destroy the world. And so the order was given, build a city in secret, somewhere no one would look. Trucks rolled into the barren mesas of Los Alamos, a region of sharp cliffs and red stone where only eagles and coyotes had lived before. The government fenced off 54,000 acres and told locals to leave. They built roads overnight. Barracks, labs, kitchens, water tanks, an entire civilization born in months. By winter, the new town glowed faintly beneath the desert stars, its lights masked by blackout curtains. Everyone entering the gate signed away their name. They became numbers, initials, code designations. Engineers, physicists, and chemists worked behind false titles and blank envelopes. Even the mail was coded. Box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. To families back home, that address became a riddle, a place that didn't appear on any map. Inside, the streets were laid in dust. There were mess halls, a tiny theater, even a school for the scientists' children. Yet no one was allowed to say where they were. Children who wrote letters to grandparents simply began them, "Dear Grandma, we live on a very high hill." Secrecy became oxygen. Even laughter was whispered. A wrong word could send you home, or worse. At the center of it all was a tall, quiet man with sharp eyes and a voice like wind through wire, J. Robert Oppenheimer. A poet of physics, fluent in Sanskrit and sorrow, chosen to direct the most dangerous experiment in history. He arrived wearing a cowboy hat and smoking constantly, more philosopher than soldier. He spoke of the stars, of moral responsibility, of the duty of knowledge.
His colleagues called him Oppie. To the guards, he was just the boss. Oppenheimer believed that intellect could save the world, that by understanding destruction, they could prevent it. It was faith wrapped in mathematics. He recruited the best: Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, and hundreds more. each one brilliant, each one bound by the same silent promise: build the bomb before Germany does. Despite the secrecy, life in the hidden city was strangely ordinary. Children rode bicycles past laboratories that hummed with radiation. Wives cooked dinners from army rations. At night, the men played poker, drank bad coffee, and argued about philosophy. One recalled, "We were trying to end death, but we were surrounded by it." Every day began with calculations, blackboards filled with equations that looked like poetry written by ghosts. Numbers danced, erasers squeaked, tempers flared. Outside, the desert wind swept through barbed wire fences, whistling like an ancient song that none of them could name. They lived between two worlds, the normal and the unimaginable. Security officers monitored every word. Conversations were recorded, mail opened, phones tapped. Even the scientists spied on one another, unsure who might be reporting to Washington. One misstep could destroy everything. Loose lips weren't just dangerous, they were treason. Still, the sense of purpose outweighed the fear. They believed the stakes were too high for hesitation. If they failed, the war would drag on. If they succeeded, millions might live. It was a moral equation as complex as any in their notebooks. The laboratories were crude, wooden huts with tin roofs and dirt floors, but inside them, history was being written in sparks and smoke. Technicians wired detonators the size of coins. Chemists mixed plutonium salts in beakers that hissed with invisible danger. Physicists debated the shape of the bomb core: sphere or lens, compression or diffusion. Every problem was solved, then doubted, then solved again. Feynman once joked, "We were building the most complicated gadget in the world with a bunch of second-hand parts." Yet the atmosphere was electric, discovery and dread in equal measure. As calculations grew closer to completion, a rumor spread through the camp. Some scientists feared that the chain reaction might never stop, that the first detonation could ignite the atmosphere. It sounded absurd, yet the math didn't entirely rule it out. One evening, Oppenheimer stood before his team and said softly, "The chance of ending the world is nearly zero." Nearly. That word hung in the air like smoke.
But the work continued. Fear became part of the process, an uninvited colleague standing at every chalkboard. Not everything was solemn. They still danced. On Saturdays, the canteen filled with music from a battered radio. Couples swayed, laughing, pretending for a few hours that they weren't creating something monstrous. Richard Feynman played bongos in the mess hall. Children built snowmen outside the lab fences. A small library lent out novels, Hemingway, Dickens, even poetry. In the margins of scientific notebooks, someone had scribbled, "When this is over, may the world forgive us." Some found comfort in religion. Others rejected it entirely. In a place devoted to pure logic, faith became its own experiment. Every night, Oppenheimer walked alone along the ridge. He stared at the stars, quoting Sanskrit verses about creation and destruction. He told one colleague, "We are learning how the universe works, but God help us when we understand." Brilliance is heavy. It presses on the mind like gravity, and at Los Alamos it pressed hardest on those who understood what they were building. The bomb wasn't just a weapon. It was the first time humans had tried to recreate the sun on Earth by choice. No one knew if it could be contained. No one dared to ask what would happen if it couldn't. They only knew that time was running out, and across the ocean, millions were still dying. News from Europe reached them slowly. The invasion of Normandy, the fall of Berlin, and then the revelation. Germany had surrendered before the bomb was finished. For a brief moment, the camp fell silent. Some thought the project would end, but orders came swiftly from Washington. Continue. Now the weapon was no longer about Germany. It was about ending Japan, fast and without invasion. The purpose shifted, but the momentum did not. By late 1944, plans began for the first full-scale test. They named it Trinity. No one knew exactly why, though Oppenheimer hinted it came from a John Donne poem about divine fire and judgment. The chosen site lay 200 miles south, in a desert basin known as the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead Man. It felt fitting. Teams were sent ahead to build bunkers, power lines, observation posts. The bomb itself would be raised atop a 100-foot steel tower, a man-made mountain awaiting its sunrise.
The convoy that carried the plutonium core left Los Alamos under heavy guard. It moved at night, headlights off, across empty highways. Drivers knew only that their cargo was priceless and deadly. At the site, soldiers called the device the Gadget. They assembled it piece by piece, surrounded by dust storms and secrecy. Every bolt, every wire checked twice, then thrice. The desert became an altar, and the bomb its offering. By July 1945, the city on the hill had fulfilled its purpose. Its residents waited for an answer to the question they'd built their lives around. Would it work? And if it did, what would it mean? No one slept easily. The heat was unbearable. Lightning cracked over the mountains at night, as if nature itself sensed what was coming. In 3 days, they would test the first atomic weapon in history, and the world would never again be as innocent or as ignorant as it had been before this desert began to burn. They called themselves physicists, engineers, chemists. But deep down, many of them knew they were becoming something else entirely. They were the first generation of humans to truly hold creation in their hands. Every morning, they woke to the same routine: breakfast, calculation, secrecy. Yet behind your routine, a quiet unease began to spread. No one said it aloud, but it hung in the air like static before a storm. Richard Feynman, the youngest of the senior scientists, found humor in everything. He played bongos, picked locks, and flirted with chaos. He was brilliant and restless. He once said, "If you can't make something fun, you're doing it wrong." But even he admitted later that Los Alamos wasn't just a playground for genius. It was a crucible. Feynman's laughter echoed in hallways filled with tension. His joy was rebellion against the weight of what they were building. In a place where everyone was drowning in fear, he refused to stop breathing. Hans Bethe, quiet and methodical, carried the mind of a machine but the heart of a philosopher. He led the theoretical division, solving problems that others deemed impossible. Yet in his private notes, he confessed doubt. "We have achieved mastery over the smallest things, but have we learned to master ourselves?" That sentence would not be published until decades later, long after the desert had already answered. Enrico Fermi, the Italian genius who had fled fascism, was both practical and unflinching. He was the engineer of the atom, the man who had built the first controlled nuclear chain reaction under a football stadium in Chicago.
To him, this project was destiny. But even Fermi, pragmatic to his core, once muttered, maybe mankind was never meant to have this knowledge. Each of them dealt with the pressure differently. Some joked, others drank, others stared at the black mountains and wondered if the world would survive their brilliance. There were no villains here, no simple heroes, only human beings standing at the edge of discovery and destruction. In the evenings, the mesas turned gold under the fading sun. The scientists would gather outside the lab, smoke curling into the cool air. Someone would start humming a jazz tune. Someone else would quote poetry. They were men who measured the universe in equations, but they still needed music to feel human. And always at the center stood Oppenheimer. He was their compass, charismatic, conflicted, enigmatic. He could quote the Bhagavad Gita one moment and calculate bomb yield the next. He inspired awe and unease in equal measure. Those who knew him said he carried two things in his pocket, a pack of cigarettes and guilt. Late at night, he walked alone to the edge of the mesa. From there, he could see the entire secret city below him, the dim lights, the faint hum of generators, the soft laughter of families who had no idea what their fathers were building. He would whisper, "The world is too beautiful for this." Then he would turn back toward the lab. The war, meanwhile, pushed forward relentlessly. Reports from Europe showed devastation beyond comprehension. Concentration camps were liberated. Cities were reduced to ash.
It was proof, some said, that the world needed something decisive, something terrible enough to end all wars. Oppenheimer men clung to that reasoning. They told themselves, "We are not destroyers, we are saviors." But in quiet moments, the justification began to feel thinner than the paper it was written on. As spring 1945 turned into summer, the pressure became unbearable. Every calculation, every test, every rivet mattered. If one variable was wrong, the entire experiment could fail, or explode prematurely, taking them all with it. The bomb, nicknamed the Gadget, was unlike anything ever made. Its design was so complex that even the people building it didn't fully understand how it would behave. It was part weapon, part miracle, part monster. The soldiers guarding Los Alamos had no idea what they were protecting. To them, it was just another secret army base. But they felt the tension too. One guard later recalled, "You could taste fear in the air, even when nobody spoke." It was the kind of fear that comes not from danger, but from knowing you're about to make history, and not knowing if history will forgive you. Inside the laboratory, temperatures soared. The cooling fans whirred. Men worked shirtless, their hands trembling from caffeine and exhaustion. Some hadn't slept for days. Their eyes were bloodshot from equations that no longer looked like numbers, but confessions. And still they pushed forward. Each breakthrough brought both pride and dread. Every success meant they were closer to the moment none of them truly wanted to see. In early July, as preparations for the Trinity Test began, arguments erupted in the mess hall. Some wanted to cancel the test until they were absolutely sure it was safe. Others insisted it was too late, that history would not wait. Oppenheimer listened quietly. When the room fell silent, he said, "It is not a question of should we, but must we. The world has already decided. We are only following."
No one spoke after that. Outside, the desert baked beneath a merciless sun. Equipment trucks rolled toward the south, carrying instruments, steel, and explosives. Men sweated under their helmets, unaware they were escorting the dawn of the atomic age. The journey to Trinity was long and rough. The road wound through cracked canyons and dust storms so thick they erased the horizon. In those moments, even the soldiers felt like ghosts moving through another dimension. When they finally arrived at the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, the landscape felt cursed. It was vast, empty, and silent, perfect for what they needed, isolation, but also terrifyingly poetic. It was as if the earth itself had been waiting for this moment, patient and ancient. Oppenheimer walked the site in silence. The wind whipped dust into his hair. He bent down, picked up a handful of sand, and let it fall through his fingers. "This," he said, "is what we are about to turn into light." Days turned into nights, nights into endless hours of preparation. The steel tower rose slowly above the desert floor, 100 feet of scaffolding that would soon carry a sun. Technicians wired detonators with trembling hands, cables coiled like veins. The bomb hung there, heavy and waiting.
Feynman described it later as a nervous animal, alive but not yet awake. The scientists set up observation bunkers miles away. Each bunker was filled with cameras, sensors, and the uneasy sound of silence. No one knew what the final result would be, not really. Some believed it would be a small explosion. Others feared it might ignite the atmosphere and burn the world. They signed their names under calculations that could have been prophecies. Oppenheimer barely slept. He drifted from tent to tent, checking instruments, smoking constantly. He looked less like a general and more like a man walking toward his own judgment. At one point, he stood before his team and said quietly, "We have spent years studying what happens when a star dies. Tomorrow, we find out what happens when one is born." The room went still. That night, lightning storms rolled over the mountains. Thunder shook the ground, echoing like artillery. The men grew restless. Some prayed. Some drank. Others sat alone, staring at their hands as if they no longer recognized them. A soldier asked a physicist, "Do you think we'll make it through this?" The scientist replied, "We already haven't." When dawn approached, the storm faded. The desert grew quiet, too quiet. A strange calm filled the air, heavy and expectant. The scientists took their positions in bunkers and trenches. The countdown began. 5 a.m. The wind was still. The air was thick with heat. Men wiped sweat from their faces, not knowing if it would be the last thing they'd feel. Oppenheimer stood with his binoculars, surrounded by silence. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind for years, yet he felt hollow. There were no words left, no equations, only the desert and the waiting. At 5:29 a.m., the world changed. The flash came first, pure white, hotter than anything on Earth. For a fraction of a second, the desert turned to daylight. Then the sound arrived, deep, primal, endless. The ground shook. The wind tore through the bunkers. Every man instinctively ducked, though they knew it would not matter. Feynman later said, "It felt like the sky had split open." And there, above the Jornada del Muerto, rose the first atomic mushroom cloud. It climbed higher than any mountain, swirling orange, red, and black. The sand beneath it melted into glass, a new material, green and shimmering, later named Trinitite. In that instant, the human race crossed a threshold it could never return from. Some cheered. Some wept. Some simply stared, unable to speak.
Oppenheimer whispered words from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." No one knew what to say. How could they? They had just seen the birth of a son and the end of innocence.
The light faded slowly, but the silence that followed was unbearable. For several seconds, no one spoke. The desert shimmered like glass, and the air tasted of metal and ash. Those who had covered their eyes peeked upward. The cloud had already grown enormous, twisting like a living creature, red at the base, purple near the crown, white at its heart. It was terrible and beautiful at once. Miles away in bunkers and trenches, men began to breathe again. Some laughed nervously. Others whispered prayers they hadn't said since childhood. Each one knew they had just witnessed something humanity was never meant to see. A soldier near the observation post muttered, "The sun's come up early." Another answered softly, "No, that wasn't the sun." For those few minutes, time seemed to split in two, the world before the flash and the world after. Oppenheimer stood motionless, eyes wide behind his goggles. His face was pale, almost translucent in the dawn light. No one could tell if he was proud or horrified. Perhaps even he didn't know. Around him, his colleagues erupted in chaotic celebration. Handshakes, cheers, tears. They had succeeded. The impossible was real. But behind every cheer, a shadow lingered. The shockwave arrived next, a deep, rolling thunder that flattened grass and rattled bones. It felt endless, as if the desert itself was screaming. Dust filled the air, cameras shook violently, windows shattered 50 miles away. Feynman ducked instinctively, then burst out laughing, not from joy, but disbelief. He had seen equations come alive, and it terrified him. One of the guards, a farmer's son from Kansas, fell to his knees. He whispered, "God forgive us." No one heard him over the roar. In the command bunker, General Groves, the military head of the Manhattan Project, smiled grimly. His job was complete. He turned to Oppenheimer and said, "The war is almost over." Oppenheimer didn't answer. He only stared at the rising column of smoke, his lips moving soundlessly. Later, someone asked him what he was thinking in that moment. He said, "We knew the world would not be the same." When the cloud finally began to dissipate, a strange quietness settled over the test site. The men walked toward the blast zone carefully, unsure what they would find. The ground was scorched black. Where the tower had stood, there was now a crater lined with green glass, smooth, shining, alien. One of the technicians bent down and touched it. It was still warm. He said softly, "It's beautiful." Another replied, "It's poison." Both were right. For the rest of that morning, the desert felt haunted. Birds had vanished. The wind moved strangely, like it was afraid. Even the light seemed different, harsher, sharper, as though the sun itself had changed. The scientists packed their equipment in silence. Some cracked jokes to hide their unease. Others just stared at the horizon, lost in thought. They knew they had created something that could never be undone. Back at Los Alamos, news of the successful test spread quickly. Celebrations broke out. There was whiskey, laughter, music on the old radio. After years of isolation, fear, and pressure, they had finally done it. The impossible was now a weapon. But not everyone joined the party. In his small wooden office, Oppenheimer sat alone. He poured a drink and stared at his reflection in the glass. Outside, fireworks lit the night sky. irony too sharp to ignore. He whispered to himself, "Now it begins." In Washington, word of the test reached President Truman. The telegram was simple: Operation Trinity successful. Within hours, new plans were drawn up, plans that would soon be carried out over Japan. No one at Los Alamos knew yet what was coming, but many suspected. The bombs had been built for war. War would have its price. When the official report came in, the scientists gathered in the main hall to hear the readings. Yield, greater than expected. Radius, catastrophic. Temperature, unimaginable. A nervous laugh broke the silence. Someone muttered, "At least it worked." Another voice replied, "Yes, that's the problem." The laughter faded. No one spoke again. Days turned into restless nights. Some scientists requested transfers or resignations. Others began writing letters to colleagues, to family, to God. They had succeeded beyond measure, but none could say they felt victorious. Hans Betty wrote in his notebook, "It is not the bomb that frightens me, but the ease with which men will learn to use it." Oppenheimer was summoned to Washington. He stood before military officials and politicians who praised him as a national hero. He felt none of it. He spoke quietly about the bomb's destructive power, its moral cost. They nodded politely and changed the subject to strategy. Later that night, he told a friend, "We have blood on our hands even before it falls." Back in New Mexico, the wind continued to sweep across the silent crater. Rain fell for the first time in weeks, washing radioactive dust into the soil. The local ranchers noticed strange burns on their cattle. Children in nearby towns saw the flash and thought it was lightning. No one told them what it really was. The government called it an ammunition explosion. The secret would hold, for now. In the following weeks, the scientists waited for orders. They knew the bomb would be used soon. Where and on whom remained unspoken. Letters arrived from Washington, brief, cold, bureaucratic. "Your contribution has been invaluable. Further testing not required." No signatures, no emotion. The city on the hill had done its job. Now it would fade back into the silence from which it came. But silence is deceptive. It hides the echoes of conscience. At night, many could not sleep. They saw the flash again behind their eyelids. They heard the thunder that wasn't thunder. Some found solace in rationalization. It will save lives. Others in faith. Perhaps God intended us to find this. But a few whispered to themselves the truth. They had opened something that could never be closed. Across the Pacific, plans were finalized. Bombs were assembled, crews trained, targets chosen. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, names that would soon become synonymous with light, heat, and death. The scientists of Los Alamos read the news like everyone else, from newspapers. A week later, the photos were grainy, the headlines triumphant, but the eyes of the survivors told another story. Oppenheimer gathered his senior team after the bombings. They sat in silence for a long time. No one toasted. No one smiled. Finally, he spoke. "We built the thing that changed the world, and the world will never forgive us for it." Some men cried. Others simply stood and left the room. The victory parades came and went. The war ended. The nation celebrated peace, but peace felt heavy. At Los Alamos, the lights stayed on, though the purpose had dimmed. The city that once hid a secret now hid something else: guilt. For months after, radiation lingered in the desert. Animals died mysteriously. Ranchers complained of strange dust coating their fields. The government denied everything. It was officially nothing unusual. But those who had stood at Trinity knew better. They had seen the birth of a weapon that would outlive them all. Oppenheimer returned to the site one last time in late 1945. The desert was quiet again. He walked to the crater and picked up a small piece of glass, trinitite, still faintly green in the sunlight. He held it to the sky and said softly, "This is the color of our sin." He let it fall back into the dust. Years later, he would call Trinity the day the world became old. And perhaps he was right, because after that dawn, innocence itself felt like a myth, a story told by those who had never seen the sky burn.
The desert went quiet again. But the silence after Trinity was not peace. It was a pause before the echo. Far beyond the New Mexico mountains, across oceans and continents, that echo spread, through newspapers, government halls, and the uneasy dreams of humankind. The age of atomic fire had begun, and nothing on Earth would ever be untouched by it again. When the war ended, the people of Los Alamos stepped out from behind the fence for the first time. They saw crowds, cities, and newspapers carrying stories about the miracle weapon. Strangers shook their hands, called them heroes. But the word miracle felt wrong. They had lived so long in secrecy that fame felt like exposure. Applause couldn't drown out the sound of the blast still ringing in their memories. Some returned to universities, some to industry. A few vanished into quiet government jobs, never speaking again of what they had done. For Oppenheimer, the end of war was not an end at all. It was a transformation. Once the guardian of a secret city, he became a symbol, the father of the atomic bomb. Reporters called him the American Prometheus, the man who stole fire from the gods. At first, he accepted the title. He believed, perhaps naively, that science could now guide peace as it had guided war. He told a colleague, "We have seen what we can do, now we must learn what we should do." But history is rarely that kind. In the years that followed, nations raced to build their own suns. The Soviet Union tested its first bomb. Britain followed. Then France, China, and beyond. Each explosion in a distant desert or atoll was another echo of Trinity, louder, darker, and more hollow. The world had learned how to end itself, and it would never forget how. In Washington, committees were formed, policies were drafted, new laboratories sprang up overnight: Oak Ridge, Hanford, Nevada Test Site. The machinery of the nuclear age turned endlessly, fueled by fear and pride. Oppenheimer found himself on stages and in offices, warning anyone who would listen. The physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose. He spoke softly, but his words landed like thunder in rooms that preferred silence. The military no longer saw him as an ally. His conscience made him dangerous. The same man who had once been hailed as the savior of democracy was now whispered about as a traitor to progress. In 1954, he was called before a security hearing. A man who once commanded the greatest scientific army in history was now forced to defend his loyalty. The irony was brutal. The creator accused of heresy by his own creation. The hearings were long and humiliating. Oppenheimer sat pale under fluorescent lights, answering questions about his past, his friends, his beliefs. The committee wanted not facts, but confession. They wanted to see him bow. And he did not.
He spoke quietly, every word measured, every pause heavy. He said, "When you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and you argue about what to do about it only after you've had your technical success." Then he added, "We have done that too well."
A colleague said, "They took his weapon, but they could never take his wound." He returned to academia, a ghost among physicists, still brilliant but quieter now. He lectured about ethics, philosophy, and the burden of knowledge. The students listened in awe, though they knew they were hearing a man speaking through regret. Meanwhile, the bombs grew bigger, the tests became louder. Trinity had been measured in kilotons, now came megatons, each one a sun, a storm, a warning. In the Pacific, entire islands vanished beneath mushroom clouds. The soldiers who watched wore goggles and prayed their shadows wouldn't stay behind when it was over. One pilot said, "The world looked beautiful from above, until I realized it could all disappear from that same view." The people who lived near those test sites told stories of fallout like snow. Children played in it. Water turned sour. Crops wilted. Governments issued denials, while the wind carried invisible truths across oceans. The echo of Trinity had found its way into the lungs of humanity. Back in New Mexico, the original test site was fenced off. A small plaque marked the place where the first nuclear dawn had risen. Few visited. Those who did often left in silence, uncertain whether they had stood at a monument or a grave. The desert, as always, was indifferent. It kept its secrets well. Only the faint shimmer of trinitite beneath the sand betrayed the memory of that morning in 1945. Oppenheimer visited once more in the late 1950s. The wind howled across the plain, carrying dust and faint traces of glass. He stood at the crater's edge, older, thinner, and more alone than ever. A journalist who accompanied him asked, "Do you have any regrets?" He didn't answer immediately. He simply said, "Regret implies choice." Then he turned and walked away. In his final years, Oppenheimer withdrew from politics. He spoke rarely, smiled politely, and read poetry. The fire that had once burned behind his eyes had dimmed, but never died. He had given humanity its most powerful tool and its most enduring question. When asked in an interview what he thought his legacy would be, he replied, "It is not for me to decide. The world will decide, as it always does, too late." Beyond him, the Cold War escalated. Children practiced duck and cover drills under their desks. Cities built fallout shelters. For the first time, ordinary people learned to live with the possibility of sudden light and silence. The same fire that had ended one war now fueled 1,000 nightmares. And yet amid all this, something unexpected happened: the birth of restraint. The horror of Hiroshima, the silence of the desert, the haunted eyes of Oppenheimer, they lingered in the collective mind of humankind. The bomb that could destroy the world also taught it, in a strange way, how precious that world was.
Perhaps that was the paradox. Destruction had become the guardian of peace. At Los Alamos, the laboratories evolved. They no longer built bombs alone. They built technologies for medicine, for energy, for understanding. The same science that once split atoms now sought to heal them. Young physicists walked the same halls where Oppenheimer once paced. On the walls hung photos of the early days, grainy, ghost-like, full of faces both proud and haunted. Beneath them, a plaque read, "May we always question what we create." Still, the echoes of fire have never completely faded.
Every explosion test, every missile launch, every diplomatic standoff, all trace back to that morning when a handful of men watched the sky catch fire. The world lives in the long shadow of that moment. And in that shadow, humanity learned something strange, that the ability to destroy everything might be the only thing keeping it alive. Oppenheimer died in 1967, his lungs heavy with smoke and irony. At his funeral, one colleague whispered, "He gave us the power of gods and the conscience of men." Outside, it rained softly. The first drops fell on the desert, washing the dust where light once bloomed. Some said it was cleansing. Others said it was memory. Either way, the desert accepted it in silence. The trinitite still glows faintly under the sun. It looks like ordinary glass until you hold it close. Then it glimmers, green as envy, pure as guilt. It is the desert's scar and its heartbeat, a reminder that once, for a single morning, the world saw itself clearly and did not look away. Today, tourists visit the Trinity site twice a year. They walk the same ground, take photos, whisper, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts in the sand. A few kneel, brush away dust, and pocket a shard of trinitite before guards call out. Souvenir or sin? Who can say the difference anymore? The wind still moves the same way it did in 1945. Slow, endless, indifferent. When the sun sets over the Jornada del Muerto, the desert turns gold, then red, then black. And for a moment, as the last light fades, the sand almost glows, faintly, softly, like it remembers. The echoes of fire never truly die. They just wait, humming quietly beneath the ground, reminding us that what was born here was not just a weapon, but a question humanity still hasn't answered.
The desert remembers, even when people forget. Wind erases footprints, but not the feeling of what happened here. Under every grain of sand lies the memory of a morning when light outshone the sun. Time has softened the edges of the crater. Sagebrush grows where glass once melted, but the ground still hums faintly, as if the earth itself carries a heartbeat not its own. Scientists come back sometimes, not the ones who built the bomb, most of them are long gone, but their students, their intellectual heirs. They walk slowly, notebooks in hand, measuring radiation, measuring history. They speak quietly, almost reverently, as though afraid to wake something sleeping beneath the surface. One of them bends down, picks up a shard of trinitite, and holds it to the light. "It's beautiful," she says softly. Then, after a pause, "It shouldn't exist." Visitors come twice a year now. They step through the fenced enclosure at Trinity site, cameras ready, expressions unsure. Some expect ruins, others expect revelation. What they find instead is silence, endless, consuming silence. A guide points to the horizon and says, "That's where the tower stood." People squint, trying to imagine the column of fire that once rose there. But the desert gives them nothing. It has learned to keep secrets. The plaque reads simply, "Trinity Site, where the world's first nuclear device was exploded on July 16, 1945. Beneath the words, a single line of green glass glints under the sun. Children touch it without understanding. Their parents watch in silence, feeling the weight of a story that still hasn't ended. The camera pans outward. We see the vast plain shimmering in heat.
In the distance, the mountains blur into the horizon. There is no sound except the wind and the faint click of a Geiger counter. History doesn't roar here anymore. It whispers. For decades, nations built arsenals large enough to erase civilization many times over. Yet none dared to use them. Perhaps fear saved us. Perhaps guilt. Perhaps a lingering memory of that first flash in the desert that showed us what forever really means. Los Alamos today is a different place. Its labs hum with computers, not detonators. Scientists work on cancer research, climate models, and quantum computing. The walls are the same, but the purpose has changed. In one hallway, a small bronze plaque bears Oppenheimer's face. Beneath it, a quote, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Tourists stop, read it, and fall silent. Most don't realize he was quoting scripture, not boasting, but grieving. Some nights, when the desert sky is clear, the Milky Way stretches across New Mexico like a scar of light. Astronomers at nearby observatories point their telescopes upward, studying stars born billions of years ago. They say all heavy elements, gold, uranium, the iron in our blood, were forged in ancient explosions. Creation and destruction are, after all, the same fire. Perhaps that is what Oppenheimer understood too late, that we had learned to mimic the stars before learning how to live beneath them.
In Santa Fe, an elderly woman once told a journalist, "When I was a girl, we saw the flash. We thought it was the end of the world. In a way, maybe it was." Her voice trembled, but not from fear, from memory. For her generation, the world after Trinity was different. Every sunrise carried a faint echo of that other sun. The documentary camera cuts to black and white footage, children ducking under desks, sirens wailing, mushroom clouds blooming in slow motion. A narrator's voice, calm and distant, says, "The 20th century lived beneath a shadow of its own making." And then, color returns. The modern desert, still endless, still quiet. Oppenheimer once dreamed that knowledge could end all wars. Instead, it ended certainty. It forced humanity to face its own reflection, powerful, frightened, endlessly curious. We are the species that splits atoms and writes poems about the fallout. We destroy to understand, and understand to rebuild. That is our curse and our grace. Philosophers call Trinity the moment mankind entered adulthood, the day we learned what we were capable of and realized we might not survive it. It was our first mirror. It showed us brilliance without wisdom is just another kind of blindness. The lesson is still being learned. Every invention since, rockets, reactors, artificial intelligence, carries a trace of that desert morning. The same question burns quietly beneath every breakthrough. Can we control what we create? And if not, who will? In classrooms, teachers show grainy footage of the test. Students gasp at the light, the roar, the dust rising like a storm. They ask, did they know what would happen? The teacher answers honestly. They hoped, they feared, but they didn't know. And that, perhaps, is the most human thing of all. To light a match in the dark and pray it doesn't burn the house down. At the National Museum of Nuclear Science, a preserved piece of the original tower stands behind glass. Visitors read the placard, "Steel vaporized at the moment of detonation." Some stare in awe,
Others turn away. Both reactions are correct. In private letters, declassified years later, Oppenheimer wrote to his wife, "We have done the work of ages in a handful of years. The world will judge us kindly or cruelly, but it will not forget us." It hasn't. His words live on, carved into documentaries, textbooks, conscience. A new generation of scientists quotes him not out of guilt, but remembrance. They study the atom not to unleash it, but to understand the balance between discovery and restraint. In that way, perhaps redemption lives quietly in the work of those who came after.
The desert, for its part, forgives no one and blames no one. It simply waits. Wind against stone, sand over glass, silence over memory. At dusk, the horizon glows bold, then fades into violet. The same colors that lit the first explosion now paint the evening sky. Gentle, natural, almost merciful. A lone figure walks across the plain, perhaps a visitor, perhaps a filmmaker. Their shadow stretches long across the Trinitite. The voiceover returns, calm and steady. Here humanity met itself, its genius, its fear, its reflection. What began as a race to end a war became a question that will outlast all wars. The wind rises again, carrying dust that once was fire. It swirls around the camera, soft, endless, eternal. Then fades. We return to silence. In that silence, we realize something profound. The bomb was never just about destruction. It was about knowledge, the kind that cannot be unlearned, the kind that demands responsibility. Knowledge that lives beneath the sand, waiting for the next curious hand to uncover it. The narrator's voice lowers, barely above a whisper. The secret city is gone now. Its fences have rusted, its towers have fallen, but its story remains, not as a warning, not as a curse, but as a reminder that the brightest light casts the longest shadow. Cut to black. The screen fills with archival text. Trinity Test, July 16, 1945, the dawn of the atomic age. A final line fades in. May we never forget what the desert taught us, that knowledge is neither good nor evil, only what we choose to do with it. The music swells, low strings, distant wind, the echo of thunder. Then, silence. A heartbeat, a flicker of light, and the screen fades to desert once more.